Hey folks, so today we're going to do a sort of a compare and contrast and look at differences between the Buddha and Jesus on the topic of wealth or money. Hey folks, so I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're interested in helping to try to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So today I'm going to take a sort of strange topic, a little bit of a different topic for today. I'm going to try to compare the Buddha and Jesus on the topic of wealth. And the reason I'm interested in this question is because I think it does happen at times that these two are confused, that we tend to think of one in terms of the other. And so pulling the two apart a little bit, I think, can give, a more accurate view of their respective opinions on this topic, and in particular the view of the Buddha. So the first thing to say is that I'm talking about the historical Jesus here, that is to say, as much as we can tell, the views of the actual person. Those have been studied for many, many years by scholars in the West, and it's pretty well understood what the historical Jesus might have taught and why he would have taught it. Basically, he was a Jewish prophet in the same line as the Jewish prophets we find in sort of the second half of the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament. And his teaching on many subjects is actually pretty close to the teaching we find there, with some innovations, of course. So, for example, in passages like Isaiah 3:13-15, or in Amos, or in some of the other prophets, we find a kind of a denigration of Israel as being corrupt, as being involved with an economic subjugation of the poor. We have to understand in the general framework of Judaism, early Judaism, the idea that there was a covenant or a contract between the Jewish people and God, and this is what we find, of course, in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible, the Ten Commandments, and the other commandments that we find in other books of the Bible. And so the idea was that as long as the Jewish people kept those commands, God would find favor with them and help them, and that they would do well and prosper. And so when that didn't happen, when the Jewish people got into trouble, when they had difficulty, prophets would tend to arise trying to understand why, and trying to understand in what respect the Jewish people had countervened or gone against that contractual obligation with God. So in this respect, certain of the Jewish prophets found that, we might say, wickedness of the Israelite people in their economic behavior, in their corruption, in their ostentatious use of wealth, in their subjugation of the poor. We also find in many of the later prophets more and more of a tendency towards apocalypticism. This idea that the world was coming to an end, or that God was going to come down to the earth and there would be some kind of major revolution, and that the Jewish people would be then, after trials and tribulations, would then reach their apotheosis. And Jesus himself very much took these two tendencies and kind of ran them together. That is, he did believe in an imminent apocalypse, an apocalypse which he said would occur within the lifetimes of his followers. And so for that reason, he was pushing on his followers a kind of moral perfectionism. In particular, he recommended that his followers sell all their possessions and come to follow him, having given away the money, basically, or at least sold their possessions. And we know from Acts, a passage in Acts, that the early Christian communities tended to be communitarian in their use of wealth. That is, that they did sell all their possessions and then put the money together, or whatever was left together, so that they could use it together, so that no one person would have access to that wealth entirely. Now, it's important to say these were not monastic communities, these were lay communities, these were communities of householders, but they were communities of householders who were expecting that there was going to be some kind of a revolutionary apocalypse within their lifetimes, and that as a result they had to become morally pure and right with God. And in this sense, it was all kinds of wealth, not simply wealth that was unjustly arrived at, that was problematic. Now, I mean, of course, for the Jewish prophets, it was really unjust wealth that was the problem. Wealth that oppressed the poor or that stole from the poor, that was the real issue with most of the Jewish prophets. With Jesus, I think things change at least slightly. And we do have this idea that you cannot serve both God and money. as we find in Matthew 6:24. We also find the famous passage that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's in Matthew 19:24, although of course in the next line he did say that, for God anything is possible. So, he was kind of wanting to have it both ways. I think his audience at the time seems to have been shocked by that kind of statement. But I think the statement is probably truer than the second. The central statement of anti-wealth is probably more to his mind than the second statement about God being able to do anything. On that same vein, there are other passages, like Matthew 25:14-30, where Jesus does talk about, it sounds like he's talking about wealth, where he talks about the two slaves, one of whom they're both given money, one of them invests that money and is able to make a return on it, and the other one buries it in the ground and makes no return. And the idea in the parable, because it is a parable, is that the first one who makes the return on the money is a better person than the other person. And some people in the modern world have taken that as a kind of a positive statement about investing and a positive statement about making more money. It's clear from the passage that this is only intended to be a simile, and that money is intended to be a simile, a metaphor for the love of God. So what he's saying is that those people who truly love God and increase their love of God over time are going to be rewarded, whereas those who don't won't. And I think in all of these passages, what we find in Jesus is a person with quite a radical teaching. We also know about his turning over the tables of the money changers, the temple. He was clearly opposed to a lot of money making. He was opposed to this kind of corruption that he saw within the Jewish community at his time. And he viewed money as basically irrelevant because it should be given away because the end times were coming. Indeed, this is what made him such a radical prophet, and what eventually did get him crucified was the way that these kinds of opinions tended to anger many of the Jewish leaders of his day. So now, having heard about Jesus, let's turn to the Buddha. Now, the Buddha was, in, I think, most ways, more moderate than Jesus about wealth. We should begin by saying, of course, the Buddha did not believe in end times. He didn't believe in an apocalypse. He didn't believe that the world was going to end anytime soon. So there was no real rush to get stuff done or to get right with anything. His view was very much that, of course, he would love if everyone practiced, but he understood that people were not going to all practice. Most people had to be lay people. Of course, the lay people supported the monastics, so they had to be there in a sense. And he understood that, given his view of multiple lifetimes, people, if they didn't become awakened now, they might become awakened in a later lifetime. But perhaps the most important thing when it comes to issues of wealth for the Buddha is that he had a dual path. That is, he had a monastic and a lay path. And for monastics, of course, were on the pure path. That is, they were not supposed to handle money at all. They were supposed to give away their money, much as we heard in Jesus talking to his followers. Now, the Buddha did say that if you were going to be a monastic, you were to give away your money. Basically, your only possessions at that point were your robe and your bowl, and it wasn't entirely clear whether those were really your possessions either. But at the very least, that was all you would have. Lay people, on the other hand, were allowed to have wealth. And in this sense, for the Buddha, it wasn't that wealth was unethical. The way it sort of seemed for Jesus it was. It was rather that wealth was dangerous. And of course, we're talking about fine differences here. Some people will say that Jesus also believed that wealth was not unethical in itself. But I think if we look at the existing statements that they both have on the topic of wealth, I think we're going to find that Jesus's were quite a bit more radical than the Buddha's were. In particular, when it comes to lay people or householders, the Buddha said quite explicitly that the pleasurable expenditure of wealth, you say, wealth acquired by energetic striving, amassed by the strength of one's arms, earned by the sweat of one's brow, righteous wealth righteously gained, expending that kind of wealth on pleasurable activities was for him perfectly fine for a layperson. There's nothing wrong with it. It wasn't unethical. So long as it's righteous wealth righteously gained, that is to say, so long as it was not unjust wealth or unjustly gained, as long as it wasn't the fruit of theft or something like that, there's nothing wrong with having it and expending it on yourself or anyone else. And in many passages, he taught what he would call a quote-unquote balanced living. He taught that one of the aspect of right action, of right livelihood, was this kind of balanced living, was to understand to live within your means, to have enough wealth to last you and to protect that wealth so that you and your family could live in a reasonable lifestyle. But balanced living meant more for the Buddha than not simply spending too much. As he says, if this clansman has a small income but lives luxuriously, others would say of him, this clansman eats his wealth just like an eater of figs. But if he has a large income but lives sparingly, others would say of him, this clansman may even starve himself. But it is called balanced living when a clansman knows his income and expenditures and leads a balanced life, neither too extravagant nor too frugal, aware that in this way my income will exceed my expenditures rather than the reverse. And this is an interesting passage. So he's saying, clearly he's saying you shouldn't be a spendthrift, you shouldn't spend too much. That's clear. I mean, that's sort of an obvious teaching, but he's also saying you shouldn't be miserly. That is, you shouldn't own your wealth and not be willing to spend it on things that are pleasurable or that are useful or that are donations to other people who need it. So it's unskillful to have a small income and live luxuriously, but it's also unskillful to have a large income and live sparingly. You should balance your income to your expenditures. That's the kind of view that the Buddha gives in these early texts. And of course, we should remember the first virtue that the Buddha would have taught a layperson was the virtue of generosity. So part of that balanced living, part of the expenditures, should be a giving to the poor, giving to the needy, giving to people who need it, giving to people of ethical discipline, giving to people who are ethical. It's important to stress, though, that while the Buddha did not believe there was anything ethically wrong about wealth or about expending wealth as long as it's been justly gained, he nevertheless would almost certainly have been opposed to the kind of rampant greed and laissez-faire capitalism that we see now in the contemporary West and the contemporary United States. He certainly believed that greed was one of the three fires or three poisons that contaminated our actions and contaminated our mind, and that therefore a life that was spent simply in greed or simply in amassing fortunes would not have been a life well lived. And that to the extent that one was to use that wealth to suborn people or to corrupt the government or to steal from others, either legally or illegally, if we can understand the concept of legal stealing, I think many of us do, then we can see that, of course, there are many aspects of contemporary capitalist living that would be very much, the Buddha would have been very much opposed to. So, in summary, the Buddha and Jesus had very different or somewhat different views on wealth. Neither of them, of course, thought that wealth was a good thing in itself. Both of them had what we might call a generally negative opinion of wealth, in the sense that neither of them thought that wealth led to the ultimate end. Both of them really did seem to, at least theoretically, want to found a group of people without wealth. In the case of the Buddha, he founded the Sangha. In the case of Jesus, at least he told his followers to sell all that they had and follow him. Now, of course, to be fair, in the case of the Buddha, he had a 35-year career after having founded the Sangha where he could make that a reality. In other words, it wasn't simply asking people to sell all their stuff and follow him. He was really able to institutionalize the whole system. Whereas Jesus, of course, his teaching was radical enough that it got him executed in pretty short order. So he didn't have the time that theoretically he might have used to do something like found a monastic order. Who knows? There's no way to know. But that said, I think Jesus' message in general was a more radical message when it came to wealth. It was really the message that wealthiness was not the same as godliness, that a rich man could not enter the kingdom of heaven, which implies really on its own that the mere possession of wealth is enough to make you problematic as a person, which is something the Buddha never really seems to have believed. In fact, the Buddha did rely on many very wealthy benefactors to donate to the Sangha so that they could create housing, so that they would have places to live. People like Anathapindika, who was a great benefactor of the early Sangha, who was clearly very wealthy, and also he became quite knowledgeable about the Dhamma in his later life. That is to say, he seems to have been a relatively skilled practitioner as well as being a wealthy landowner. But in neither case, of course, did the Buddha or Jesus believe that wealth had anything to do with the final goal. And that is perhaps the most important message in both of them. So while wealth may have been useful for the Buddha, while wealth may have been a real problem for Jesus, nevertheless, for both of them, wealth was something that had to be overcome, left behind in some sense, in order to achieve the final goal. And for both of them, striving for wealth per se was not going to get you there. And so both of them had a wise message in that sense, that the striving for wealth is something that leads only to stress, it leads to bad behavior, it leads to unskillful behavior, unwise and unkind behavior indeed. If we can understand the ways that wealth indeed corrupt both the world and ourselves, we can attempt to leave it behind, even while understanding that there's nothing intrinsic in it that is wrong. It's simply that it's dangerous. And I think that is the best message we can take from the early Buddhist teachings. But I'd be interested in your own take on this matter, which is an interesting and complicated and somewhat divisive kind of teaching, in both their cases, actually. So if you have any comments or questions, do feel free to leave them down below, because I always love reading them, and I think everyone else likes reading them as well. They're very useful for all of us to see what we're all thinking about this kind of matter, and we can kind of approach it from many different angles. So thanks so much for watching. I always love reading your comments and questions. Thanks for your past ones, thanks for your future ones, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.